Az irodalom hazatalál. Ezt a címet adta a Litera azoknak a portréfilmeknek, amelyekben számunkra fontos írókkal látogattunk el szülőhelyükre. Most egy Magyarországon született, de Angliában felnőtt szerző miatt egész Norwichig mentünk. Hogy kiderítsük, ki az a jelentős költő, akit kitüntetett a király, aki lefordította az ember tragédiáját, és az angol hangja többek között Tóth Krisztinának és Krasznahorkai Lászlónak. Hogy kiderítsük, ki is George Szirtes valójában.
I'm being bedded in. To what kind of soil remains a mystery, but I sense it in my marrow like a thin drift of salt blown off the strand. I am an Englishman wanting England to win. I have written that I saw myself as a tenement, as a Budapest tenement block, which is, if you like, my deep heart home in an English suburb somewhere, which indicates something about a slight feeling of unnaturalness in living in quite such rural, provincial circumstances, which I've grown to love. But I know I don't essentially belong here. Recently, I've started to describe myself as a guest in this country. But there's this question which remains of, if you spent a very long time in England, do you become English? We were very well greeted in this country and became at a heroic point of Hungarian history and so forth. But that question of belonging is complicated. I'm fully British, which is different, but ethnically I'm not English. And what is it to be English? Long ago, nearly 40 years ago now, I decided that if I'm dying and that I'm getting close to death, I want to be in a specific courtyard in Pest, which I saw that for the first time in 1985 or 6, and I immediately felt, yeah, this is my space, and it's a humane space, and it's full of the right sort of history. You catch the tram? I'll sit behind you where you will not find me. I see your every move. Believe me when I say you would approve such thoroughness and objectivity. So this is the route you take across the city. The tram goes rattling on. You touch your hair before you stand and walk off down the street. My parents didn't talk about anything concerned with the war. Little by little things came out. So I didn't know that my father had done this thing called munkaszolgálat, which is forced labor or whatever. Not exactly, but something like that. And I knew eventually, I'm not quite sure how, that my mother had suffered in a concentration camp. My mother was a photographer, as the title of the book tells you. And my father was then working within the government in a ministry, in a sort of quite a high up administrative post. We're in a corner, and if you cross the road, there is the List Ferenc Tér. And there are photographs of me in List Ferenc Tér, which my mother took when it was wasteland. Sometimes I think I see a memory very clearly, but then when I look through the photographs, there's a photograph of me leaning over the pram of my brother, and I thought I remembered the moment. And when I looked at the photograph, I thought, maybe I'm remembering the photograph. And then it's a very kind of layered notional memory, I think. There was fighting outside. The bullet that flew into the room and ricocheted off the ceiling and hit me on my watch, which did suddenly. It was a sharp blow and the watch was broken. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea if it was a bullet. But that is the story I've had from both my brother and my mother. What they said was my father was out seeing what was happening. And there was some fighting in all kinds of places in Pest. So I remember that. I remember very clearly also getting out of our flat and moving to somebody else's flat and passing corpses in the street and passing tanks in the street. And my father later told me that I had terrible nightmares and I woke up crying and screaming for 2 or 3 weeks. So these are interesting but unconscious traumas. My mother was worried that my father, who had been in the Ministry of Building, might have been an object of whatever, persecution. He might be in danger. So we moved to a friend of my mother's called Irene, who lived on St. István Körút, and with a couple of big dogs. And it was there, it was decided that we would definitely leave. And then we had to pack quickly. You had to be very careful what you said in a train, and we were told exactly what to say. And then about 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm guessing the time, we are in Austria, because my mother told me about this, that there's suddenly a light in front. We're in a group of about 12 to 15, 18 people, just making our way across the fields. And you go up across a bank, and suddenly there's a light in front, and it's a soldier, and there's screams, the women start screaming. We have been caught, but it was an Austrian soldier. And then we were taken to a refugee camp, and we spent 2 or 3 days there. My father threw away his party papers and everything else. And then there were these facilities where you could go to this tent or the other and ask to be taken somewhere from there. Where would you want to go after this? And my father, who could speak English, he was the only one who could, asked to go to Australia, which is where we have a cousin. He has a cousin. Well, he says, Australia are not allowing in refugees at the moment, but we can take you to England. Some blurred depth in their eyes won't come to rest. Perhaps they're trapped in what they bought, in all their trappings, in a slim white frame of the square photograph they sent back home to show the television. Now they're caught and solemn. Slowly they become the stillness by which they are both possessed. So as soon as we arrived there, I personally was not party to these decisions. My parents decided we would speak English. Reasons? Get the children used to it. I have a younger brother, Andrew András, who stopped speaking altogether for 3 months. But I picked it up very quickly. I have no memory at all of the process of learning English or of forgetting Hungarian. It just was there, then it wasn't there. And it wasn't there for a long time. I mean, my father was the only one who actually spoke English when we came. So my mother had to learn as well. And so we're all speaking broken English together. And they had to find jobs, so that's fine. I had to go to school, and I managed very well in school at that stage. And English became the natural language. Everybody else spoke it. There were Hungarian friends, other refugee friends, but they were my parents' friends. And they would speak Hungarian with them. I'm assuming my father and mother spoke Hungarian between each other, but spoke English to us. They thought we were never going back. I mean, we were illegal, but left illegally. And they had no idea when they would go back again, if ever. And Hungarian would be of no use to me. When I went back first in 1984, it was an experience that completely bowled me over. It reorientated me, and I can see that. I felt it then, but I know it now. It changed my sense of language. in a way, English became stranger because it was, which is not a bad thing for me as a poet. I think it's probably quite a good thing. I didn't study literature. I studied sciences, physics, chemistry, zoology. But I wasn't very good at any of them, and I was least good at physics, and I fell in love with art, and I went to art school. But the poetry began just before then, when a friend of mine in a school corridor showed me a handwritten poem by somebody we both knew. I didn't think the poem was good. But by what criteria, I don't know. But at that point, and it sounds absolutely ridiculous, this is what I want to do. Well, this is a period probably in, still must be 60s. My mother must have had one of her operations and she was sent home and she had to recover and she couldn't do any work. And because she had been so and the house needed cleaning, there was an agency which provided cleaners. And some of these were unemployed actors. We did have one unemployed actor. His name was David de Freitas. I vaguely remember him. But another one was, as it turned out, David Bowie. He came to clean maybe twice. And on one of the occasions, I found him in my room picking up one of my books and reading it. And I was thrilled at something. I didn't know who he was. And he wasn't called David Bowie, he was David Jones then. But he was clearly a very confident young man. And he was already, he'd made an album, I think. And he was studying mime. That's how I worked it out, it was him. So he was studying mime with Lindsay Camp. He looked like David Bowie. He had slightly different color eyes. I kind of envied him. I was still at school and in my school jacket. And there's this really cool guy. He was actually very friendly. And who was going to be making another album. David Jones, not David Bowie, later to be David Bowie. Please cooperate with me and turn your head. Smile vacantly, as if you were not dead, but walked through parallel worlds. Now look at me as though you really meant it. I think we could be good for each other. Hold it right there. Freeze. Well, I have yet to meet the king. So that was announced in December. Before that, sometime in the autumn, I was rung up by Simon Armitage, the poet laureate, and he told me I'd been awarded this, but I couldn't possibly tell anybody until there was an official announcement, which turned out to be in December. Then I got that, and then they said he would receive this medal. It's a totally unexpected thing. One doesn't expect anything really, but this is the last expected thing. And I haven't really worked out its significance, except it's an honor, and of course one is very flattered and pleased by any honor. And at some point, this is Shortwave, where I first started writing about Europe and the desire to re-enter it somehow. This was the next one. So that came out in... Okay, so this is 1986. That is 1984. It's the year I first go back to Hungary as a writer, as an adult. This book came out before the visit in the same year. This book came out as a result of the visit. And this is the book which specifically introduces Hungarian themes in 3 longer poems. And then people begin to refer to me as a Hungarian poet, which they hadn't before. One of the interesting double-edged things is that one gets a certain exotic value as a refugee. There's a romance floating about this. And it is out of the English experience generally. So you're both a foreigner and you're English, and that is heightened by the photographer in the winter. This is Metro. It's got all kinds of sticky labels on it here. Metro was written in I think I was right about the date. Yeah, it's 1988. So it's written after 85 and 87 were longer stays in Hungary, month-long stays, 10 weeks, 10 weeks. And at that point, the story of my mother, which I knew partly became more important. And if one can talk about oneself in this way, is that psychologically, the figure of my mother was a map that mapped onto the map of Budapest. So the two were sort of automatically identified in my mind. I'll tell you a very interesting thing my father said about that poem in a minute. But in a way, the figure of my mother opened up Budapest. She appears quite a lot in A Photographer in Winter. And at that point, I became something else. I became a Hungarian Jewish poet. And frankly, I haven't actually written very much about being Jewish at all. It has not been very much a part of my conscious life. But I can't help but be aware of it as my historical life. My parents' life was deeply, inextricably part of their lives, despite their atheism, despite all of that. And if I come back to the question of the King's Medal, that is one of the interesting parts of the proposition. What does Hungary mean to anybody here? Who the hell knows anything about it? Could they tell you the capital? Some people could. Could they tell you anything about its history? If I tell them about the history of Hungary, which partly explains the way it is now, I think, does it have a place in English literature? And it was an interesting ambivalence that as far as Hungary goes, I'm the only writer outside of Hungary who's written a lot about your damn country. But you don't care. And I kind of thought, okay, well, I guess I'm a curiosity in Hungary until you meet the king. And then you come in a more interesting curiosity. And you're a bit of a curiosity here because you bring this material in. And the only way it can work for them is not that I ever consciously formed any kind of plan, but that the reason it would work is partly on a human level, partly because it's vivid enough. What did Vosh say to me once? He says, because I was comparing with the selling of books in Hungary. How is poetry doing in Hungary? It must have been about 90, 91. He says, well, when people don't have shoes, they need poetry. Once they've got the shoes, the poetry is less important. Here they've got the shoes. Hungary's not always had the shoes, and I think it has that level of consciousness. Where are you going? To work? I'm watching you. You cannot get away. I have been trained to notice things. But all will be explained, and you will know why it is necessary to follow you like this. In the meantime, carry on as usual. Do what you would normally do. In the period before 89, really from the 50s, 60s onwards, Hungary was part of the Soviet sphere. It has a kind of heroic place in the historical imagination, especially in 1956, which is one of the reasons when we first came here, I wouldn't say we were greeted as heroes, but we were warmly greeted. We were people who had escaped the Soviet tyranny, the way people thought about it. And so it was there's an element of glamour in it, and things have changed. So although Hungary was an object of specific kind of interest, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, big swell in the 80s. And then Hungary is not a great object of interest now. So when in 1989 came along, got as far as that. I think that's the year when the Madách came out. And when things started happening, and I went to everything. I was on the marches. Have I mentioned that it'd be good to know Göncz Árpád? Okay, so I was given in March 1989 by the Hungarian Writers, whatever it is, Association, a week in Szigliget. It was lovely. They gave us a prize room, a balcony, and it was beautiful. Clarissa came with me. The children were not out in Hungary yet. They joined us later. This is just a week before March the 15th. So it was an interesting week anyway. And one day when we were walking around the gardens part of it, there's a nice man in a blue tracksuit who started talking to us in English. He introduced himself as Göncz Árpád. I had no idea of his significance. It was just extremely nice. His English was good, and it was chiefly translating from English. And let's meet again. And the March the 15th came and went. And then after he became president, we remained friends. We didn't see him very often because once he's president, he can't just see people, but he did see us. And he gave me the Dairy Prize. There are photographs of that. And so in a way, at one level, I felt I have found my soul brothers, yeah, that I was amongst people for whom I had enormous respect. People whose ideas were sophisticated, but liberal. I probably have more in common with them as a society than I do here. I've got very good English friends, other poets who I like very much. But in this sense, odd psychological sense, there remains a kind of point of gravity. I don't know what to do with it, except I've been writing around it all this time. There's a sort of imbalance in life, which was partly to do with the language, partly to do with the idea of being a guest. That's to say, you're not a permanent fixture, and you never feel as though you're a permanent fixture. And that sense of slight existential edginess is where a good deal has come from. That and the eternal kind of love with the slightly exotic English language. But I could begin to sound a bit pretentious now.